Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my rather belated November 2024 reading wrap-up. I actually am home, kind of sick, trying to get over cold symptoms this weekend, and I'm hoping maybe I can cram in a few videos if, the energy calls for it, because, we're getting to that midway point of the month, and there's lots to do on this channel, including wrapping up last month's reading. Most months I try to do reading videos a couple times a month, but because of NaNoWriMo, I don't do that in November. I talked a little bit about some of these books on my NaNoWriMo vlogs, but not all of them, so I thought I'd, streamline things here. And I also officially have my November literary newsletter to share, which I will link down below. In that newsletter, I highlight literary news that caught my fancy. I have snippets of the Goodreads reviews I wrote for all of these books. I have a book pick, I have a book quote, etc. So without further ado, I'm going to get into it. The first book I read in November was Tablet Shattered by Joshua Leifer. It's, as a physical book in my thumbnail, but I've had to return it to the library since I took that thumbnail. Anyway, this also is my entry into Nonfiction November, but actually it's not the only nonfiction I read this month, so that's kind of exciting for me. It's a little more than my usual, other than when I'm reading for the BookTube prize. But anyway, stop rambling. I really wanted to get to this book. It's kind of become a buzzy book in, some Jewish circles that, are interested in, the American Jewish experience, and Leifer is a sort of younger millennial, is a new sort of voice on the stage. He's much more openly critical of sort of things that are considered like establishment in American Jewish culture, and critical of a lot of ways the relationship between mainstream Judaism and how they perceive Israel and the Israeli government's policies, and how that is putting strain on having American Jews affiliate with the community. And it's broader than that too. There's ethnographic changes. There's the fact that most Jews are actually going to be living in Israel within the next couple of decades, which is shifting realities. Like post-Holocaust, America was the place where most of the world's Jews lived, and now that's shifting, and he's questioning our relevance and talking about who we are as a community, how we sort of perceived ourselves. He really starts mostly post-Holocaust, though, doesn't go much more before that, even though there obviously was a Jewish presence in America before that. But there's been shifts, and a lot of, his ancestors and mine came to the States around the same time, which was basically with late 1800s, early 1900s, from the Pale of Settlement, and kind of really clung to American assimilation and American exceptionalism, because America was a place where we could actually be citizens rather than, subjects of the Russian Empire. But, he delves into basically what our past and our present is, and anyway, it's relatively critical. It can be a little bit bleak. I think he's trying to find some sort of way through the morass and speak to a generation that is far less okay with the strictures of how things had been going for a few generations before. It's also a book he was pretty sure would be like boycotted at synagogues and that sort of thing, but in fact he was going to have this book launch in Brooklyn, and it was an anti-Zionist book employee who unilaterally tried to cancel the event because he would be speaking with a Zionist rabbi. And it's interesting too, because he wrote most of the book before October 7th, but was able to get in a little bit afterwards, sort of, because he's, somebody, more on the lefter side of the left than, well, even me, and also, certainly the establishment. And he was struggling and trying to come to terms with some of the anti-Semitism of the far left, and of course he also gets into anti-Semitism of the far right, but mostly it really is geared at American Jews and sort of the broad trends we're on regarding Zionism, regarding religion, etc., and he's fairly critical of all of them in various ways and trying to find a way through it all. And I think it's a really interesting perspective. I think it's new and compelling. I do think, sometimes when you stay so broad-minded, you miss the trees and just, you're focusing on the forest. it actually encouraged me to do a fair bit of rambly writing for NanoBlogMo, thinking about the American Jewish experience and my experience. I'll link that down below as well. And I have to say, I think it just was, I didn't always agree with everything, but I think it was a challenging, compelling, and new perspective book, so I did sort of highlight it as my favorite book of the month. The next book I read took things down a bit. I think I was doing a little seesawing, I think, between like 5 stars and 3 stars, and then I did have a couple of 4 stars in here. But this was, a 3-star. It's called The First Mrs. Rothschild by Sara Aharoni, which was translated from the Hebrew by Yardine Greenspan. And this was a very bloated historical retelling of Gutle Rothschild, who was the wife of Amir Rothschild, who was the one who basically started the dynasty and was able to make banking choices that moved his family into sort of the wealthy banking dynasty it is known for today. But she had more modest, really, beginnings and lived her whole life, which was mostly in the late 1700s and early 1800s, in the ghetto in Hamburg, Germany, where Jews had very limited rights. And so it's a really interesting idea for a story. And back in October, I also read a nonfiction book on the Rothschild women. So this was an interesting complement to that. But in terms of the writing, this was incredibly bloated. I thought it was very purple in prose, very exposition heavy. And of course, she also relied very much on the epistolary style, that it was diary entries, so that it was even less of a story and even more of a slog as she was describing this woman's life in the most sort of rambling and boring prose, where I felt like I just was not connecting, and I just was kind of waiting for this to end. I feel like maybe along the way there were some characters or situations that intrigued me, although I think it was largely bolstered by, the knowledge I already had from, the nonfiction I read, that, that kept me more invested in this story. And I ultimately feel like just the writing style of this and the fact that, maybe she should have tried to, cut it down a bit. it didn't work for me as well. It was a little bit of a disappointment. For my page 112 tag pick of November, I did definitely go for something much smaller, much more streamlined. This is Kaddish.com by Nathan Eglander, the second novel I think I've read by him. And it's, I enjoyed it for the most part. It was really, it was fun and irreverent, maybe a little contemplative too. It starts in 1999, where this man Larry, who grew up modern Orthodox, is at his sister's house for his father's funeral and Shiva in Jewish custom, which is the week after a death, where the family mourns the dead person. And since this was Larry's father, in religious Judaism, he has very specific obligations for the next year to say the Kaddish, which is the prayer for the dead. But Larry is, at this point in his life, not religious and doesn't want to do this. And there's a big sort of debate between his sister and a member of the community and the rabbi about what to do about this. And ultimately they decide, well, if you can find another man to sort of hand this off to, who would, remember your father in your stead, I guess that would be the debt is paid of sorts. And because, they couldn't count on Larry to actually do it anyway. So Larry goes to the website Kaddish.com, which, fun fact, I'll point to a JTA article, someone actually has made a similar website recently. And the point is the same. It's for family members who, for whatever reason, cannot mourn their dead one properly, can reach out to this website and the religious Jewish community and have somebody say the Kaddish for them for that year in their stead. So that's what that's what Larry does in this. In this book, in the fictional book, the website is run by what they claim to be a yeshiva in Jerusalem, and they'd get like a yeshiva boy to say the Kaddish once, fill out a form with, details about the deceased and make a donation. So that is Larry's big way out of this. And, for a while it works out well. The year passes, the father is mourned properly, everyone moves on, but Larry has an about face where he becomes religious again, and he changes his name to Shuli. He marries a religious woman, has children, even becomes a rabbi, teaches at a yeshiva himself, and ultimately has a midlife crisis in the second part of this book where he realizes, I'm sort of, overwhelmed by the guilt I feel that I shirked off this really important duty. And even though, like, the religious community is like, that happened when you were not religious, you're doing your part now, you don't have to, be too bent out of shape about it. Shuli is bent out of shape about it, and that leads to actions in the third part of the book where he tracks people down in Jerusalem and the yeshiva to try to basically, he makes up a sort of legal ritual, a religious ritual of sorts to try to, take back this right that he gave to this yeshiva student to mourn his father in his place. So that's what the book is about. Obviously, it's about a very specific mindset of religious Judaism where these emotional realities are very important to them. Although Eglander himself, he was, raised modern Orthodox and now is not religious. And he said part of the reason he wrote this book is he thought it was kind of crazy to him to think he might go back. And in a way, that's what this book is about. And it is, kind of witty and maybe even absurd at times. And I kind of lost the plot with it in the final part. I felt like it was more interesting when it focused on Larry/Shuli rather than the weird intricacies of the yeshiva and what was going on there. So that's what brought it down a little for me. But ultimately, I enjoyed it, and as someone who has some Jewish knowledge, it was interesting, small dive into the world and these issues. My next 5-star read was in fiction. It's The Fortunate Ones by Ellen Umansky, which, I've been comparing this a lot to We Were the Lucky Ones by Georgia Hunter, which is much more famous, though relatively written around the same time and relatively about the same topic. It's a Holocaust fiction. We Were the Lucky Ones was recently turned into a Hulu adaptation. I even wrote a review of it, which I'll link down below. And I figured I'd ultimately get to this one and it would be like, but actually I enjoyed this book more. And I don't need to compare it anymore to We Were the Lucky Ones, it's its own thing. This is a dual narrative novel, and like a lot of Holocaust fiction that I'm actually drawn to, it has to do with art theft. I feel like that's my way to sort of engage with the Holocaust in maybe interesting ways that, well, sometimes I feel like it's a little bit of a distance from the true horrors, like We Were the Lucky Ones. But what worked for me here really was the characters in this. So in one storyline, we're following Rose Zimmer, who in Vienna in 1939 is put on the Kindertransport, which is, a way that the Jewish community tried to save their children at that time and was able to make connections for them, like usually in Western Europe and England, to save their lives and stay with, other Jewish and other communities there. So Rose and her brother are on the Kindertransport. They survive the war. Their parents do not. After the war, Rose is taken by, the idea of Austria trying to make some sort of amends, and her parents had a particular fake painting by a real artist that she is trying to find, and ultimately that does lead her to the father of the second narrator, who, through a series of, art theft and auctions and that sort of thing, gets his hands on the painting, although he doesn't ultimately find or contact her until after the painting is stolen again. And anyway, a few decades after that, this man dies, and Rose connects with his daughter Lizzie at the funeral, and they strike up a relationship. They both have an interesting relationship to the painting. Lizzie was holding a house party as a teenager when the painting was stolen and feels some sort of guilt about that. Ultimately, there's sort of a bigger, plottier mystery story about that, which is kind of not, mystery isn't really my thing. It's fine, it works in the story, but I was really taken by the characters. I felt like, they were bigger than their plots. I felt like the writing was beautiful in a way of, making the environs come alive and the interiority of the characters come alive. Rose is dealing with so much guilt, survivor's guilt about surviving when her parents didn't, and it just informs her life in so many ways in the narrative as we see it from, the 40s onwards. And then Lizzie is a Jew of, the 20th and 21st centuries, and she has her own things going on, too, where she has had some, trauma in her backstory. And I was just impressed that, it was just very real and raw, but also it didn't feel like it was, making some sort of mockery or whatever out of the Holocaust. I just felt like it was just a real depiction of Lizzie's issues with her father and with her the rest of her family, and just she also had a really deep character as well. And I'm a character reader, and I was just really drawn into the complexity of these two characters and how they sort of found each other, and how this artwork sort of and trying to find it again brought them together into a relationship with one another. And it was just a really moving story about loss and trauma and how to, move on with your life after said loss and trauma. And, life, the universe, everything. But instead of with platitudes, it's, explored in meaningful, nuanced ways in this novel. And then I dipped down once again from the 5 stars to the 3 stars with The Map of Salt and Stars by Zeyn Joukhadar, which this one really disappointed me as well. It was one of the books, like the last book, that had been on my Goodreads TBR for so long that it made my top of the Goodreads reading goal. And I've loved this cover so much. The expansive sky, the beautiful blues, the title with the noun of noun and nouns, reminding me of fantasy titles. And in a way, there's some fantastical writing in this, but there weren't enough specifics for me. I think I just ultimately could not connect with the story as much as I hoped to. Even though the storyline is almost fantastical because of how far back one of the storylines goes in the past. But anyway, it's a dual narrative. The first storyline is with Noor in the summer of 2011. She and her family have moved back to their ancestral homeland in Syria after her father died in New York. Of course, around this time is the start of the Syrian civil war, and they ultimately have to leave their home and try to get out of the country. Only Noor has American citizenship, so they can't get out easily, and they take this circuitous route around, the Middle East and, in southern Spain and that sort of thing. And inadvertently, they are following sort of the mapped out treks of Roia, who, 9-10 centuries earlier was someone who lived roughly in the same area. She was a young girl who, perhaps in an anachronistic sort of style, wanted more adventure in her life, and ends up seeking out an Arab map maker who appeals to the King of Naples, who wants, a map of, the Middle East and North Africa and all of that. And they go on adventures together, and there are some fantastical things that happen to them. It's based on mythology, so, they encounter mythological creatures and all of that. The whole book, both storylines, are, I think, really vague when it comes to, describing real socio-political realities, which on one level, gives an interesting and sad sort of argument to the fact of all of the clashes in the Middle East and North Africa that have persisted for all of these centuries. And it's interesting, I suppose, to, hear different names of different kingdoms and empires and that sort of thing. But, I mean, as a character reader, as someone who likes to be grounded in something a little more tangible, the fact that, Noor is in a very specific and modern time period in Syria with, what's happening with the Assad government and groups that are against him, something that, has had a recent upswing in the news of late, new developments in Syria even more recently than this book was published. But it just, the fact that this book didn't really focus at all about any of that stuff made it feel very unmoored. Like, I could maybe forgive it more for a storyline that took place, 9 centuries ago. Those situations aren't as pertinent to real, geopolitics and human realities today. Although it would have also been interesting, I suppose, to, learn more about those cultures and how the characters related to them more specifically. I don't know. I mean, she was, I think, maybe trying to be more universal about the idea of displacement and wonder. And again, I guess in a way, that's why the stories didn't quite fit together, because Noor and her family were forced to migrate. And Rawaya was, somebody who, just made that choice for herself and her life. So the stories don't quite go together. And I just couldn't necessarily grasp onto any of the plot, such as it was in this novel, because I feel like this author was way too focused on the flowery language of it, and my mind kept wandering away from what was actually happening on the page. So, yeah, ultimately this was a disappointment. To jump back to a 4-star read, because I felt like this was pretty useful, it is The Author's Checklist, An Agent's Guide to Developing and Editing Your Manuscript by Elizabeth K. Kracht. I like to read craft books, writing craft books during NaNoWriMo, which in a way is a weird time to read them because you're supposed to be focused on the writing and not the, mechanics behind writing and other parts of the editing and publishing journey, if that's your jam. But I read these books then anyway, and I like this one. It was, I can't call it a 5-star. You can't be in love with what's basically a checklist. I'm a narrative reader. I'm a character reader. But it was, in terms of useful information, a very useful book, something that would be very easy to glean through when certain things come up in writing, either fiction or nonfiction, writing, editing, publishing, marketing, and all of it. When it comes to writing in either fiction or nonfiction, she is an agent for a variety of genres, which is pretty cool. It gives her a pretty broad perspective. And I focused a fair bit on some of the writing things that are, in my crawl lately as I'm drafting the end of my fantasy novel, and it was interesting to agree or disagree or ruminate on what she was saying and all of that stuff. And I thought, ultimately this is a good thing for writers to grapple with. My final 3-star read of the month was Liberation Day, short stories by George Saunders. I got this collection signed a couple years ago at the National Book Festival. George Saunders is a beloved literary fiction writer, and this one that did not work for me. First of all, he was writing, dystopian speculative stories, and I do not like when most literary fiction writers try to get into that mindset. I don't agree with the choices they make. They don't speak out to me as, actual storytelling, and that intrigues me. It mostly just seems like style over substance. And a lot of these stories were really style over substance. I mean, we were so neurotically into the heads of these characters who, by and large, I couldn't connect with them at all, and their small little lives and their melodramatic plot points. I couldn't connect with it, and I guess I'm not as literary snob as I thought I was, that, I couldn't just coast on the language alone. I just couldn't. Some stories I kind of liked more than others, but overall I wanted something more grounded. I wanted something a little less neurotic, maybe even something a little less, fraught about the realities of the world, which I also feel fraught about the realities of the world, but I couldn't engage with how Saunders is feeling fraught through these neurotic little stories. So I guess it was just good to know that this author might not be for me. Maybe his novels would be. Maybe I'll have to try them. I did read his essays on teaching Russian fiction in graduate school for the BookTube Prize, and I really liked those. I don't think these are much like the Russian fiction short stories. I don't know. So that's my defense. But to end on a high note, and something I actually haven't discussed in any of my nano vlogs, I read The Gates of Gaza by Amir Tibon for my synagogue's book club. And this is one of the first post-October 7th books written by a Haaretz journalist. Haaretz is a left-leaning paper in Israel. Tibon lived in Nahal Oz, which is the kibbutz closest to Gaza. So on October 7th, the kibbutz was overrun by Hamas terrorists and other Palestinians, looking, maybe for looting and that sort of thing. and for 10 hours, Amir and his family were in their safe room, trying to survive something the safe room wasn't really, structured for. The safe room is supposed to keep people safe from rockets, not from, fighters on the ground. And the Israeli military was so caught off guard by October 7th, it took a long time, much longer than it should have, to start rescuing the survivors of Nahal Oz and the surrounding area. So in some of his prose, which is just really terse and compelling, he's describing his family situation, and he's describing the situation of his neighbors, and it just like moves seamlessly through those. And then in alternating chapters, he's giving more of a broad history of the conflict, and with some specific attention paid to Nahal Oz and its foundation and its history after 1951. And so I found it very moving and just really well put together, obviously written by a journalist. I could quibble slightly about some disjointed nature, about, sometimes he was able to take more of a step back from the politics, and then when Netanyahu came onto the scene, it shifts much more into emotional territory. Overall, and I'm just saying, narratively, I guess it's a little disjointed, and ultimately that doesn't matter much to me. And overall, it's just impressive on its surface. He was, he and his family, including 2 young daughters, were in peril for hours. He lost, friends and neighbors. They were killed and they were taken hostage and they were tortured. And he was still, with this book, really able to give, I think, a pretty clear-eyed account of what happened and of the history and behind this conflict. I think that's pretty commendable. I agree with, reviewers who would say this is a book for people looking for the nuance, not for people who, are beating a drum for one, extremist side or the other. And it's about a real person, with left-leaning sensibilities, like a lot of kibbutzniks are left-leaning still, trying to make sense of reality in a fraught region, in a really fraught time. It primarily focuses on Israel on October 7th. There is a little bit post-October 7th, and he does, give a little bit of a nod to the horrors of the war afterwards. But ultimately, its focus is before then. But I think it's a really moving, well-written perspective. And that about covers it for me now. My battery is telling me I've rambled on a lot longer than I hoped to. And now I have to sit down and do all of the editing for this, so huzzah! Luckily, my next video I've already pre-filmed, so I guess that'll help, with the post-production aspect and getting it up quicker. It's my page 112 tag video of December 2024 to put this is a TBR game I play where I choose 3 unread books from my physical shelves and compare page 112s against each other, and then add one to my month's TBR, which I should also get to reading ASAP. I still have a lot more to read of my December reading than I'd like to, but what else is new? So yeah, I got a lot on my plate. And I hope you are all juggling your responsibilities, booktube reading, whatever else they might be, with a plume as we wind down these final few weeks of December. And thanks so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.